All right, hello everybody. My name is Tyler Ken. I'm the head of exhibitions and Zudi Family Curator of Contemporary Art here at the Columbus Museum of Art. And we really are extremely grateful that you're here, sort of, with us this evening. Yeah, just thank you so much for joining us. And, you know, especially perhaps today on this International Workers' Day of May 1st. Our thoughts are with those who are really on the front lines at the moment and who continue to labor, and as well as sort of all of those who have been affected by the COVID-19 global pandemic. That includes just about everyone on the planet, but certainly some more than others. And so our hearts go out to those. From the outset, the work that we'll be discussing this evening has been about a certain form of labor. There is a big boss, and then there's the middle class, mid-level strivers whose work has become, you know, in many cases abstract, pushing pixels around on a screen. And I think the pandemic has really made us think about the relationship between bodily presence and work in a new and quite profound way. But you know, at the moment, just a word of gratitude to all of those who put their bodies at risk in the service of their work at the moment. And so, with thanks to them, we hope to reopen the Columbus Museum of Art, you know, soon, and to welcome you all physically into the museum so that you can see the exhibition that we'll be talking about this evening. So with, for the moment, however, let me introduce the two who are with us virtually. Anita Chari is a political theorist and writer based in Portland, Oregon, and is associate professor of political science at the University of Oregon. Her work explores the significance of aesthetics, artistic practices, and embodiment for political theory and practice. She is also a contributor to this volume, Geof Oppenheimer, 20th Century Hustlers, publication that accompanies this exhibition that we are immensely proud of, and that neither Geof nor Anita have even seen in the flesh yet. But we will, I think I'm one of very few people who have actual copies. Geof Oppenheimer is an artist living in Chicago, Illinois. He's associate professor of practice in the Department of Visual Arts at the University of Chicago. His practice takes up questions of civic value, the ways in which political and social structures are encoded in images and objects, and how meaning, you know, how we form meaning in the modern world. His work has been exhibited nationally and internationally at a variety of institutions. Quite recently, the Marion Lee Block Museum of Art, PS1 MoMA, Contemporary Museum Baltimore, Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Site Santa Fe, Indianapolis, and the Aspen Art Museum. And let me start sharing my screen here, and we can see a little bit of, I will basically introduce 20th Century Hustlers, the exhibition that we're talking about this evening. Here again is that book. I should also mention that we have contributions from Richard Sennett, and which we are also really grateful for. It is a very beautiful book. On the cover, you see a landscape that we will be getting into in a bit during our conversation. But the video is separated into two sections. One takes place in a Lincoln Town car with these three characters in the back seat. That is the first sort of chapter, and the second takes place in a family restaurant, as it's called, with these two men sitting across from one another. The a note that some of the visuals are blurred. Maybe if I do that. Does that help? Sorry. I think it's to be expected that we'll have maybe some technical difficulties for which I apologize. We'll see what we can do. Let me know in the comments. Sometimes, as with the bandwidth, the image will clear up as as we go along. So if it's blurred at the moment, I hope that it sharpens up for you. After extensive testing, we got it to be clear, but I'm sure there are still some gremlins and ghosts in the system. This is the exhibition as we see it in Gallery 5 of the museum. It is a single monitor jutting out from the ceiling, suspended on this hot-rolled steel column pole, and it is surrounded by office chairs. The back of this monitor is a really sort of beautiful object, an aesthetic object sort of in itself, and the treatment of the bracket and the mount is quite sculptural and something that I think that's our sort of relationship that we'll get into as well as we go along. The edge of the pole. And sort of navigating this monitor, which is suspended right in the middle of the screen, is very much a part of the work. And the office chairs are not just placed in one relationship to that screen, but are scattered all over. They can be moved around, sat in, and sort of occupied in quite different ways. I'm going to play a bit of the film at the moment. I'm going to do it from a QuickTime. If you'll bear with me. Let's see.
I thought by now I'd have turned to stone.
We're supposed to maintain the order. We're distributors. We're all topics across all nodes and replicated to multiple brokers. And then we wait for the next message.
With a fear.
With a fear like Philip Roth, who acts like Miles Davis. We're past pronouns, baby.
We're past pronouns, baby.
Past pronouns, baby.
We're past pronouns, baby.
Past pronouns, baby.
Past pronouns. As if Atlas and Sisyphus were the same guy.
It's early evening, violet hour. We are air conditioned and moving, gliding, really.
Skin and body turn to gold, along with arbitrage and all things that dissolve into money.
At first he thought it must be a test, and in time signs would emerge. But then their son started wearing long black coats no matter what the weather. A long black coat. An earlier version of themselves would have understood. He's just grasping at unclean hands. That's all. There was many a night. The only way he could get through it was to imagine the day. To imagine the day and the noun to describe it. In time, that same light will fall on us too. If he had some drinks in him, he'd admit, he always thought he'd be able to retrace. Told the hours there'd be more remaining with his family. He was becoming an asshole because he secretly thought he'd be leaving with his friends, distant. One could say it out loud, but this is a family restaurant.
Right. There we go. Anita, go ahead.
You're on mute, Anita.
Oh, look. Ah.
There you are.
Okay, great. You can hear me? Great, I couldn't unmute myself. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much, Geof and Tyler, for the opportunity to talk about this work. So I wanted to begin by highlighting two aspects, actually, of 20th century hustlers, which I find really compelling for the present moment, and also that I find to be broader themes in Geof's work as a whole. And the first is the way that this work explores the shifting fortunes of masculinity in the immaterial economy, and how basically how changes in labor in this period of neoliberalism in terms of post-industrial economies are connected to broader political, social, and emotional dynamics. I think we could think of this extended Trumpian moment really as a kind of loud death rattle of a certain form of modern masculinity. And I think it also comes at the end of a particular formation of labor. And so I see 20th century hustlers with its modular treatments of these different kinds of archetypes of masculinity within the different atmospheres of and changing atmospheres of labor as a kind of provocation to examine these ideas of masculinity and labor as aesthetic phenomena. And just to think about this theme as a kind of theme that I see in Geof's work, also his previous work. I wanted to talk about the embarrassing statue, which is the piece that you see, the image that you see there on the screen. Above all, I think in this work, the embarrassing statue, there's a kind of playing out of the shifting fortunes of masculinity amidst this changing symbolic economy. And I think that this statue presents a kind of masculine figure, it seems, and with a leaf blower strapped to its back, proudly standing upon this marble plinth. And at the feet of the figure stands lies an expensive pair of Brooke Brothers pants, revealing a column of brass-plated beams that hold up his naked figure. Embarrassing for many, many reasons. And so I think that this leaf blower gestures at the kind of dual indignity and enjoyment of manual labor, which seems like such an important theme to be considering in light of immaterial economies and the kind of shame of masculinized material labor in the immaterial economy. I think, also with the leaf blower functioning as a phallus, there's a kind of interesting, play on the question of the affects of masculinity. And I see both in this embarrassing statue as well as in 20th century hustlers, a refusal to assign fixed values to the various types of identities that we see and that they explore. So that while at times these works may appear to be a kind of elegy for an economic and symbolic world that no longer exists, I do not see either of these works as being nostalgic for the past or optimistic for the future. Instead, I see Geof's work as really embracing the inherent ambivalence of our times by dissecting identities, treating them as material to be fractured, manipulated, and transmuted into new forms. So, and in my view, this is really an important counterweight to the kinds of polarization and affective melodrama that we see in the politics of our times. So I'm also, secondly, really very interested in the way that 20th century hustlers makes use of a number of elements that I could only describe as sculptural, in the sense of that they find a kind of still point that captures the potency of movement, and not only in a visual or even somatic or affective sense, but also even in a political sense. And here I have a question for Geof on this, which is the question of just, I'm really interested in how sculpture as a form informs at a political level your video and even photo works. And so I'm thinking here, of course, of 20th century hustlers, but also works like The Therapy of Groups, which is the next slide. Yeah, this work here. So from my perspective, there's something really compelling about how the sculptural form, when it's opened up into a more dynamic medium like video, allows you to almost wrench open in a physical way political perception, which is one of the things I found most fascinating about 20th century hustlers, which is really kind of what I saw as kind of almost a perceptual physics that I see happening in that work. And I, also just kind of the reversal of that, I kind of see a reverse movement of that in some of your more properly sculptural works. So, which are very much about solidifying and objectifying immaterial political messages and affects into material forms. So another work that I think about in that light is Love and Other Abstractions, which should be the next image. Yeah, this work here where, as you can see, on top, there's a neon sign there, which references economy, culture, and society, and kind of the way in which messages from these different realms of society kind of imprint themselves onto, in this case, onto the statue below, which is made of a highly absorbative graphite. So there's this kind of way in which that sculpture, and if you could maybe go to the next image after that. And even one more, I think. Yeah. You can see then that it's like there's almost, there's a way in which this statue is kind of deformed almost physically and sensorially by these messages, being so absorbative of them. And then also another work I think about is your work Money Decades, which is the next one. And in this work, which is kind of, you had mentioned to me as kind of a companion work to 20th century hustlers, translates this process of extrusion, a cheap neoliberal form of construction, into a kind of into an artistic process. And so here you have the Lincoln Town Car extruded into the form of this sculpture. and the Lincoln Town Car seems to symbolize a whole entire epic and kind of way of life that then gets transmuted in the process of this sculpture. So Geof, I'm interested in the, in this kind of play between materialization and affect. And I was wondering, if you could maybe also talk about that and how that relationship morphs in the various media that you work with.
Sure.
Should I just want to say one, I'll just finish this off. Or well, okay, yeah, I'll just finish this off so that you can just jump into your thing. Finally, I just wanted to say that, I think that I want to acknowledge that here we are in this kind of weird moment of the pandemic, a moment that is both kind of, I would say, extremely intense in terms of the forms of threats to people's physical and economic survival. And in another way, I would say also kind of boring in the sense of that, quarantine as an aesthetic phenomenon is not the most exciting for those of us who depend on society for our creativity. And so I think this moment poses interesting problems for reading contemporary art, especially art that has been produced recently. And we often rush in the art world as well as in academia to theorize something before we have actually lived it. And so I don't want to do that or to instrumentalize the work by imposing a reading in this light. But I do want to say that I see in 20th century hustlers a kind of elegy for a way of life and labor that is ending, that has ended. And, so I would just say I see this work as a prescient work in a way that probes the affects of a way of life that was very generative. Also in ways that you show in this work, I think also surprisingly very beautiful, but also mythical and violent. And so in this way, I see it as a prescient work, but more about understanding what has ended, which only keeps on ending rather than describing the shape of something that's to come.
I think that term describing the shape is a really good phrase. I understand your question, but for me, I just make the work and I don't have an enormous distinction in the studio between what is a video and what is a photograph and what is a sculpture traditionally defined. For me, it's all sculpture. Like I would make I think a cogent argument that 20th century hustlers is a sculpture. And one of my instructors, really early on sort of pounded into me that sculpture is a thinking process as well as a media. And it's really just a kind of, as you intelligently said, like a just forming of material to unpack its sort of social legibility. And in regards to the political, the kind of alienation that sculpture traditionally has, like it's of the world but separated of it, it really provides a great form to unpack the kind of political economy of stuff. And we live in a world of stuff, and in that sense, Marx was wrong. We don't live in an environment of scarcity. We live in an environment of material overabundance. And the assigning value to those is sort of why I'm an artist. Like, how do we come to form as a group value between the stuff that we interact almost as a medium between ourselves with, is sort of what I'm interested in the studio. And because of that, it's all fair game, right? So whether it is something that is moving in the form of ones and zeros in a video, or if it's extruded steel, it's all just a way to sort of unpack its social legibility. Because if one thing the pandemic has taught me, like, I think I'm like an honest to goodness, old school humanist. Like, I'm really very interested in how people interact with one another. And in that sense, it's all sculpture. Am I answering your question?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's kind of how it feels when I see the different things that you make. It's like I see this video, for example, and it feels like a sculpture to me. So that's really interesting to me. But yeah, how you put that.
And there's lots of ways to make, like, there are videos that I make and videos that my antecedents make that are sculptures, even if they are in linear form. And then there's other videos that are emphatically not sculptural. It's just how you manipulate the material as an artist that sort of can bring about different sort of material qualities of the medium.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of your work constructs, I think, a kind of a narrative. I mean, it depends on, on certain, the way we read certain elements, such as the headlights of a Lincoln Town Car and kind of the specificity of a Lincoln Town Car as you, and what that sort of means in a kind of larger cultural context. Next to these extruded beams or, Brooks Brothers pants and a leaf blower, and what the sort of frisson of those two elements and how we can, as viewers, construct a kind of a narrative of like what happened to that Brooks Brothers suit wearing person who is now wearing a leaf blower. What is the relationship between those two things? And for me, there is a lot of narrative imagination that sort of brings up, which is exactly, I think, the kind of meaning that you're talking about, how we form it, that making meaning. The video itself has 2 chapters that are quite distinct. And for me, it is almost, analogous, I would say, to that relationship between the Brooks Brothers pants and the leaf blower, are almost there with the leaf blower. It's a slightly different class we're talking about in the sort of second half of the video. But I was just interested in how you saw that relationship between the 2 chapters in terms of making meaning.
It's nice to hear you say the word narrative. I never thought of it that way. This is a very romantic statement, but I think, everything is a think. Like every material or object or image in the world has a kind of embedded social legibility to it. And I think I work best sort of using the linguistics of all that stuff and putting it together in new sort of statements or poetry. And so that's sort of how I operate in the studio. And I think it's also how I operate in the editing space, like with video. To answer your question really explicitly, I don't think I know yet. Like when I make a work, it always takes me a couple months to really understand some of the decisions I make. Like, contemporary art of our moment, it's smart stuff. We're talking about smart stuff, and it's all part of what it is to be an artist in the 21st century. But when you go into the studio, it's your lizard brain that is just as, just as in charge in making the decisions. I can say this is that I wanted these 2, they're definitely chapters. Like I know, Tyler, when you and I were talking about the project, I really emphatically was calling them chapters, they're not sections or whatever other word you would want to use. And they are not, those groups of people are unaware of one another. And I think I am interested in the sort of psychic effects that we have on one another without self-awareness. So the decisions that are being made in part of the world is affecting everyone who's involved in this Zoom conversation without us even being aware of it. And systems have a kind of anonymous power that is emphatic, sometimes nefarious, and completely invisible. And those gentlemen sitting at the table were really in a conversation, an invisible conversation with the 3 people in the back of that town car, and vice versa. And so I wanted them to be sort of bifurcated and involved with one another, but really formally and kind of explicitly separated. that was sort of my thinking when I was making it, like whether that is what's happening in the piece now. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know yet.
Maybe let's turn to headlights. Yeah, those two chapters. I feel like maybe I should unpack a little bit of the sort of context behind each chapter. They stem really from two different situations, both happening in the year 1981 here in Columbus, or at least that provides some, so the restaurant scene is based off of this play by Samuel Beckett, Ohio Impromptu, which was commissioned by S.E. Gontarski and directed by Alan Schneider, who's a really, significant Beckett director. Here in Columbus at the Ohio State University, we're looking at a poster that is actually in the museum's collection. It was designed by Sid Chaffetz, an artist who worked at OSU. So that was May 9th, 1981. And just about the same time, there was the development of Metro Center, which is on Columbus's outer belt. The city is ringed by this highway 270. And out in Dublin area, it's actually the first office park, suburban office park that was developed in Columbus. And there's sort of the fact that they were both constructed in that sort of moment of 1981, which has its own sort of political resonance. Country is sort of like coming, into a recession at that moment. The Reagan Revolution is happening, and the whole sort of laissez-faire or a neoliberal kind of world order is emerging really from that moment. That in that second chapter, or in the Beckett play, really, it is about. There are two figures who look exactly the same, dressed alike, with this long white hair and wearing long black coats. And a lot of the language of the long black coat is transferred in your video. It sort of borrows these kind of atmospheres, these linguistic sort of affectations, from the play are directly into the dialogue in the film. The film itself, rather the play, does not take place at all in Ohio, but Paris. And you have what it is really sort of at bottom about. It's a single figure who removes himself. There's kind of like this nameless who this figure becomes estranged to, moves to the sort of an island in the middle of the Seine in Paris, where he kind of mulls and rejects thoughts of return. But it is in a real state of self-alienation. And in that state, I mean, for me, the second figure becomes this kind of dissociated body who comes and visits. And that is the only speaker, is this kind of ghost who is telling the story kind of the other silent figure in the on the other side of the table. And it all ends with the two figures, well, the speakers, says sort of they sat on as though turned to stone, which is sort of mirrored in the first line of your film, actually in the first chapter, which I thought is kind of interesting, this kind of image of petrification that kind of moves between the play and the video. So you see the two figures, this is kind of, the angsty Beckett, theater of the mind, I think is really transposed into the kind of terms of an economic anxiety. And for a particular kind of class, and yes, we can also talk about, the role of sort of masculinity, gender here. These are two men. But we don't have a Brooks Brothers suit here. We have these kind of khaki chinos and a navy blue blazer, which speaks to another kind of form of sort of office labor, a kind of abstracted office labor. Sorry?
I was very interested in the term like middle brow when I was sort of developing the characters out, like confidence in their sort of intellectual labor at a mid-level. What is an increasingly squeezed part of the economic system.
Mm-hmm. And as they, at the sort of conclusion of the second chapter, the camera pans, as it does throughout the whole scene, and then finally sort of crops out the speaker and frames the silent listener, who becomes, I sort of feel like, our new protagonist. And kind of like in the Beckett play, you start to realize, oh, maybe the speaker wasn't a speaker, but a kind of figment of the imagination of the listener. So this kind of sort of doubling and redoubling, which is a kind of an image that is spoken in the play and in the video, becomes very much what the work is sort of about psychologically. This kind of external body, which is the same, as one's own, which might actually, we can talk about sculpture in those same terms. But for me, that image sort of like here in Columbus relates a lot to kind of the artist of our moment, Edward Hopper, who, and there was any number of kind of American painters in this period who are considering kind of new forms of labor, new classes, new urban and even suburban kind of realities, and what that is, what that means not only in terms of kind of the fabric of the city and social life, but what the kind of psychological effects of that is. And this work from our collection, Morning Sun, kind of really comes to mind. But also, this work, Nighthawks, which is in Chicago, where you are, is kind of inescapable. I know that the corner window was really critical to the kind of location scouting here. And we should thank Indochine Cafe out in Whitehall for their location. It's a great restaurant. But yeah, I don't know, I kind of wondered what you made of this kind of comparison, which I sort of pulled out.
I explicitly asked you to talk about the kind of art historical antecedents you saw in the piece, because I was just curious as the curator of the project how you sort of placed it, and I was really thrilled to see you choose Hopper, because I love him, as a lot of people do, and specifically, there is the kind of like American ennui in his work that I just can't get enough of. The sort of almost Steinbeck honest portrayal of a kind of idiom that I really am attracted to, but also just the way he handled light. No one handled lonely light better than him. And certainly in the scene on the left at the restaurant, I was really interested in a particular type of Midwestern soft luminescence that scene with all the reflection and the sort of breaking apart of the image would provide. And that was really important to me to have. And, Hopper did it first. So I agree for sure. I also think there's something about seeing through something, like the idea of a screen and depth that you have with the glass plane, and you have in the installation with the glass, well, not glass, but you have with the screen of the television. All those things were really important to me in their thinness, like the world they're operating on, especially in the first chapter. I was really interested in that world being about the thickness of the LED screen and nothing more. I think, you know, you're always looking through something in a hopper, even if you're in the same room. And that was something that was really kind of important to me thinking about it.
I mean, something, I mean, as you see these three characters sort of riding endlessly around this office park, which itself has a kind of a looped kind of roads, along with these reflective facades, which I think are also very much a part of what you're talking about in terms of the screen. You see these lakes and trees reflected in the and the car itself reflected in the facades. For me, the kind of image that kind of thinness of the screen really provoked is this one from Superman. The sort of beginning. I forget the name. General Zod. Condemned to live in this eternal two-dimensional space in the same sort of flatness that you feel like these characters are sort of trapped in. Having the screen right there in the middle of the gallery with kind of like nothing but another chair and a door and a wall behind it, you really, I think, perceive that thinness. And there's I think a kind of relationship between that formal and visual quality and the kind of conceptual system that you're discussing, or maybe the economic system. I mean, the business that these characters are engaged in is completely nebulous. They're distributors. You really don't get a sense of what they are producing, except for these kind of meaningless messages, these messages that bear no information, or maybe information, but certainly no meaning.
I mean, I thought of them as manipulators as opposed to producers. Like, they're not making anything. They're just sort of manipulating information around and, arbitrage, basically making profit off difference. And the kind of thinness of that, like a kind of information world, sculpturally is very thin to me. And so, like, you absolutely know where I live. That Superman 2 reference is exactly correct in my mind.
The sort of other image that always struck me in the relationship, with those landscapes and with the kind of complete entropy that they seem to be like confronting, the idea of sort of fear, the idea of petrification, of things really grinding kind of to a halt. There are failures in this system, and they're really threatening all of the light speed motion, of those messages flying around the world and through different distributors. So, both, I think, the kind of psychological, almost allegory that's created, that sort of, could be, for me, so maybe I can unpack this work, Man Ray's Dust Breeding, which is simply a photograph of the dust that collected on top of Marcel Duchamp's large glass, and turning that kind of flat plane into something that looks more like a landscape. Where here, this kind of with your work, that sort of landscape seems very much like a flat plane, and something that is kind of, entropic. And you even have a kind of a little moment there where, with an aerial view onto this sort of dirt patch, which I think is conceived of this kind of like this element of like fear, this of kind of this entropic stasis that the whole system is kind of going to grind into. So anyway, that was just kind of like a thought that sort of occurred to me, or sort of an image that kept coming back to me as I was thinking about the work. But
you know, one thing, I think I can answer your question about the two chapters a little bit more. I think I can answer it a little bit more formally maybe than intellectually, but like, I think the first chapter with the three individuals in the back of the car, I wanted that to be really unstable, right? It's really kinetic, like the edits are rapid, the sort of gyroscopic cameras in the back of the car almost form like a panopticon around the subjects. Nothing is stable, everything is in flux. There's moments of like the chroma green behind the image that sort of flashes out, like the actual structure of the RGB of the video shows its seams. And, you know, there's a constant churning and sort of violence to it, maybe like the economic sphere that they speak to or sort of embody in my mind also has in common. It's a, you know, a quick world. The second chapter, it was really important to me that it was really conventionally filmed. It is a single edit. Well, it's a cheating. There's edits in it, but it appears as a single take. It is one continuous, very stable pan from right to left along a track. So the camera work is, you know, incredibly smooth. And there's a stability to their world that was important to provide in contrast to the first chapter. And I think it's about these two different sort of moral universes that that are occurring side by side. And, you know, I think when you were talking about the Man Ray, like that, you know, it's funny, you know, one of my colleagues sent me this awesome interview with Man Ray, just walking around the Philadelphia Museum by himself. He's like touching all of his own work in the museum. It's like a kind of artist fantasy. But he talks a lot about like kineticness and violence in the work that he was trying to do. And I think there was an element of that sort of breakage in the first chapter that I was maybe not, you know, I don't think I could articulate it at the time, but I think that's what I was going after now that I hear you speak about it.
Stop sharing here. Maybe I'll put us, let's see, it's coming on 4:48. I feel like we should, I feel like maybe this question of gender in the film is something, you know, of Anita's is something that maybe you would like to come back to, Anita. I'm not sure we addressed it.
Well, you know, I mean, the thing about gender, to me, it was specifically really about how masculinity plays this, you know, huge role in the kind of imaginary of a certain kind of bygone economic system, you know, almost like if you think, for me, looking at the embarrassing statue, like it represents this kind of, you know, not to reduce masculinity, but there's a certain affiliation with a type of masculinity, and then also a type of materialized labor. And then this affect of embarrassment is so interesting to me because it seems to play this interesting role also in the context of like the Trump era, you know, in the sense of like signifying something about emotional ambivalence, you know, towards, you know, I mean, it functions on so many different levels, economically, in terms of like the way that we gratify ourselves, like in terms of labor, like shame about material labor, in terms of the rise of Trump and like what happened, what's the deal with the white working class, you know? So, I mean, all of these things are kind of what I was thinking about when I talk about, you know, gender or masculinity there. But yeah, I would love to hear, Geof, how you think about that.
I mean, it's an active element in my work, like redefinitions of identity without any sort of judgment. You know, I think I'm interested in a really subjective type of reportage rather than kind of objective editorial. And so just to kind of unpack what these different states are today is really interesting to me. And, you know, I'll also admit, like, all art is self-portraiture. Like, I'm a guy. What is the avenues of masculinity available and appropriate in the 21st century is like totally something I think about. I think everyone should think about that. And so, you know, in the embarrassing statue, it was sort of like an embarrassment about it, you know, which I and probably a lot of men have felt at certain times. But then I think that piece is a little older, and I think the kind of, I would like to think there's a little bit more nuance about it in 20th century hustlers, for sure. But it's definitely there. I think it's a kind of perennial interest of mine in the work.
Yeah, and I really appreciate that aspect of how your work, you know, looks. I mean, you say it's subjective in a way, in the sense of it comes from your own, like, reckonings with the kind of double binds, or, you know, also pleasures of it. But I also think I really appreciate how there's also a dispassionate way of looking simply at the aesthetics of it too. You know,
I'm interested in art that is, I mean, for myself, I should say, I'm not that interested, and I don't think I would be that good at art that is like extremely prescriptive in its politics. Like, it's not my interest.
Yeah. I appreciate that, though, actually, is what I would say, especially on that point, because I appreciate how it then allows for a kind of sensory reorganization.
Yeah. That's a good way to put it. I agree with that.
If any of our viewers have there's a question here in the Q&A on the note on gender. I think there's also something similar happening with race in terms of questioning a certain kind of white middle class power.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, I would. I don't disagree. Let me put it this way: I don't disagree, but I also think I'm just interested in the dynamics of power. Like, it's not. The back of that town car is populated by a very diverse cast of characters with sort of fluctuating power relations between them. Like, the man in the middle who appears to be the boss happens to be Black. But if, you know, you watch the entire video, it becomes, I would like to think it becomes quite clear that the power is actually more centrally located in the American woman on his left. And so there's a instability of those traditional dynamics of race and power in the United States in the car, where I agree with you. In the second chapter, it is, I think Anita used the word eulogy. There is that about a kind of middle class, typically white power dynamic.
That's great. And if there are other questions, don't hesitate to type them into the Q&A. Could you speak more to the decisions around scale in the video and the installation, particularly the contrast between the range of scale in the video and the sort of very familiar, even tepid scale of the installation itself? Although, actually, I should say on that note, the monitor is like I think the installation shots might be a little deceiving. It's quite a physical presence, that monitor in that space.
I can try. Like I said in the beginning, like I am a traditional sculptor by training, and the idea of like autonomy for the objects, like the sculpture itself has a certain amount of like human rights to it, and so I wanted that monitor to be not just a mode of display, but also an active sort of protagonist in the room. And so unlike, some ways to do it where the monitor would be against the wall or projection or what have you, it was important to me that the scale of the monitor and its placement in the room was something that the viewer's body had to confront, as well as their optical system. Like they have to walk around it, penambulate around it. And that was, or is really important to me, that your gut feels something in the room with that thing sort of projecting from the wall ceiling. And the video in the scale in the video, like I was really thrilled to be able to utilize the technology of the drone as well as the gyroscopic camera. Like the kind of issues of registration and the ability to see, like at the very literal level, were really important to me. So the drone, which is a very new way of seeing, like you think about it, that type of viewpoint has not really been available beyond military use for long. And so drones, raison d'etre is registration. Like I am 3,000 feet above the ground. How do I register on this quite small object? The technology to do that is pretty sophisticated and sort of, to me, speaks about the ability to see information that the people were talking about in the back of the car itself. And so there's all sorts of different scales in the first chapter, micro and macro, and there's a kind of violent intersection between the two. The second chapter, again, totally stable. Like it's basically one scale. They're sort of monolithic, as it were, as the camera orbits around the two figures. That chapter has as much to do with Rodin as it does with anything else. Wait, is there another question? Am I reading that correctly? Is there a question?
About the West. And its sort of import in terms of identity in the video. Sort of why Columbus? Why the Midwest?
That's a dope question. I really am interested in that. I really like your question, and I don't know if I have a concise answer to it, but it's definitely something that I thought about more when I was conceiving of the work than when I was making it. But I am interested in a kind of idiom. One of the actors who I hope is listening right now, George, he was the man who was delivering the lines in the restaurant. He's a great actor, and he had the quintessential Midwestern dialect, and he delivered the lines beautifully, and I chose him for that. There is, regionalism is a bad word in the contemporary art industry, but I actually am quite interested in it. Like, I think having a smaller scale of how we think about community is actually maybe good for the world. And having the work speak to a particular Midwestern landscape and the light, like I mentioned earlier, all that stuff was really in the front of my mind when I was making the work. And you know, like I said, like I haven't quite, like, I mean, it would be really boring and probably Tyler wouldn't be into it, but having this conversation like in a year, I would probably have better answers to some of these questions, but it's definitely something that's on my mind for sure.
Yeah, I also would just say one thing about the whole Midwest question, which I think is a really good question too, because, you know, just in looking at your work, Geof, specifically this 20th Century Hustlers work, like the function of Ohio just seems so fundamental, not just also in the ways that you're describing, which is so interesting to hear about, just like literally the landscape and the dialect and whatever the elements, but I think also politically it's interesting to think about Ohio, you know, in the Midwest in terms of the really important role they've played in politics in the last few years, you know, in the rise of Trump and like questions of the shifts in labor and like how really those shifts in labor have created like determinate political conditions where a lot of people have felt really left behind, you know. Yeah. And I think that's something I saw as being expressed in the affect of this piece too, in a way of like, especially in the second chapter, you know, just the level of uncertainty and angst around that.
The loss of control. Those men do not have agency. Yeah, I mean, that part is more explicit and more true. Like, for example, Metro Center was made in '81. One could argue that was the beginning of the post-industrial economy in the United States. And certainly in Ohio, the industrial sector really started to empty out then. And literally leaving the city to a place like Dublin, Metro Center was one of the first office parks. It's a very Arcadian. It's like if Frederick Law Olmsted was hired to design a glass walled office park. And there is, I don't think that's by accident. I think there is this sort of depopulation, deindustrialization, economic activity moving from an industrial scale into a kind of suburban glass-walled office park. Those characters in that second chapter are affected by that change. And that's something that, again, I don't know if it made it into the video, but it was a lot of the stuff that I was thinking about when I was sort of organizing the forum.
It feels almost like, you know, the work itself was made, and certainly it feels like we opened that exhibition in another age now. And we are at the beginning of something else, and certainly a moment that will be defined even more by its precarity. And it's changed the way we had seen things, you know, very simple things, you know, like the distance one keeps with others outside one's home. And, you know, I'm wondering if there is something in the work that, aside from the fact of 3 people who are not, found sheltering in place in the back seat of a car together or in a restaurant, like how we might see this work differently given our current situation.
You want to take that one, Anita?
Sure. I mean, I can say what I think about it, which is that, you know, which I gestured at before, you know, and wanted to really say, because I think that it's a problem for us now. Like, it's a real problem for us that we confront in the midst of this pandemic of like the urge toward interpretation. Do you know what I mean? And it's you know, especially a problem for thinking about contemporary art in this moment, because we so want to rush to theorize things, I think, because we want to understand our situation, which is where the impulse from which this work comes from anyway, you know. So, but I really I tend to feel like I would resist that impulse, you know, and would say rather that, you know, this work really is about an ending that just keeps on ending. And that's what I feel like. It's like this work is really about a form of labor and a form of life that is over, but we keep hitting a new bottom in terms of what it means for it to be over. you know? And so in that way, I would say the fact that it is this kind of elegy for a bygone thing, you know, that continues to be true. And I actually see this current moment, oddly enough, maybe I'll regret or won't think this way in another 2 months or 1 month or 1 week, but I see this moment as actually part of an extended continuity of things that have been happening over the last few years, rather than such a moment of rupture, even as we confront the intensity of it. You know, I don't see this as that, you know, I see this as a development really of this whole Trump period. And a culmination of it rather. And in that light, I would say that reading 20th Century Hustlers in this moment is about reading that ending that just keeps on ending.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And like the Trump, what we're calling the Trump moment is actually like from Reagan. You know, it's like a long arc. I mean, I made the piece in the 21st century and I called it 20th Century Hustlers. Like there is a sort of backwards looking to the piece. Like it is a sort of, I mean, eulogy is a better word, but I think I thought of it as like a sort of closing of an epoch or something like that. But I'll admit this is, this whole experience is really intense, which is stating the obvious. And I was having a Zoom conversation with one of my colleagues who's an art historian. He said, like, contemporary art started in 1972 and ended about 2 months ago. So like whatever's next is going to be something different. But what that is, I don't think anyone knows that.
Well, speaking of endings, I think we're on time at the moment for an ending ourselves. But I wanted to express my appreciation to the both of you, as well as to on all of our whole staff. I wish I could name everybody in the institution. Perhaps I'll single out Jordan Spencer, who was for the production of this commission video. I should probably mention that it was indeed commissioned by the Columbus Museum of Art. It will be open through the middle of October. Certainly once we reopen ourselves. And yeah, thanks once again to everyone who is participating here. It's really great to have you all.
Thank you, Jeff. Thanks, Tyler.
With that, have a good evening. Take care. Stay safe in your own bubble and be well.